My series of little videos on life in Malahide in the 50s and 60s, as I remember it, focused a lot on the shops of the village, etc., and not so much on the castle itself, though it does get a mention, of course. But the interesting thing about the castle and me is that that's where I grew up, in the environs of the castle. And my father came there in 1938 to take up the job as butler, and he remained butler there from 1938 to 1972 when he died. Now, in 1972, he died of cancer, lung cancer. And just before he died, about 6 months or so before he died, Lord Talbot asked him would he mind putting together some notes for the next person who might become butler for him. So my father duly did that, and I have the notes here with me, and they're quite 10, 11 pages of tightly typed notes that he made up on the duties of a butler and recommendations, etc. I'll read little snippets from it, which might be find it interesting. And it does reflect the times, of course, the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, when butlers were, I suppose, fairly common in very large houses in Ireland and England. And probably at the moment there's very few of them. To my knowledge anyway, I think it's a sort of a dying thing. The butler must use his discretion in dealing with callers apart from invited guests. In case of doubt, it is advisable to ask them to wait and to ascertain if his lordship wishes to see them. One will soon learn to distinguish between the sheep and the goats. It would be advisable, when guests are expected, to find out their names beforehand. It can happen, and did once to me, that an error is made. Once a gentleman was expected for lunch. What looked like a gentleman arrived at the specific time. I duly showed him into the dining room, only to discover he was an antique dealer, calling to see if there were any furniture for sale. So that was a bit of a mistake. Now, during summertime, particularly in Malahide, one finds a lot of callers who, having read of Malahide Castle and its contents in guidebooks, expect to be shown over the castle. These people must be politely told of their mistake, and while sympathising with them in being misled, in no circumstances must they be allowed into the house. In all cases, the proper attitude to adopt is of politeness to all and familiarity with none. Now, I think this reflects the situation whereby the castle, of course, was very private, and people were not encouraged to go there, even though it was publicised that the castle existed and its contents were in books, etc., as it says there. But it was a very private place, and people from the village, for example, sometimes never went near it at all. And even some kids from the village, they might have played in the woods a little bit, but they kept their distance from the castle. It was this big austere building. Now, receiving guests. The proper manner of receiving guests is to ask the ladies, "May I take your coat, madam?" And then the gentlemen's coats, umbrellas, etc. You then ask, "Who shall I announce, please?" The butler always precedes the guests upstairs, and still proceeding shows them the reception room. He enters first and announces in a clear voice, "Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, Captain and Mrs. So-and-so," as the case may be. Diplomats are announced thus: His Excellency, the Ambassador of so-and-so, and Mrs. So-and-so. If I recollect properly, ambassadors and diplomats take precedence and should be announced first. When all expected guests have arrived, a period of about 10 minutes is allowed before announcing the meal. This is done by opening the door and saying, "Dinner is served, my lord." So the notes then describe how the guests are treated, how they're seated, etc., and how the meal is served, and the proper way to serve it. When removing plates, use the left hand, etc. So then he went on to talk about serving of drinks and the wine. I thought this was quite interesting because it reflects the times when people had large cellars of wine and how they cared for them. All red wines are usually decanted before use. White wines can be served from the bottle. A napkin is folded around the bottle with just the neck protruding. Allow one bottle for every 4 people. If a lunch consists of more than main course, cheese and sweet, you should allow more wine or keep a reserve on the sideboard, as the longer the meal, the more wine will be taken. I am no expert as regards wine, and a lot of nonsense is talked about various grades, but His Lordship will always tell you beforehand what wine is required. Be sure and find out immediately after breakfast what type of wine is required for lunch, if any, because if he disappears into the garden, you are unlikely to see him until lunchtime.
That's because the Lord loved his garden and spent most of his time in his garden. He just disappeared there whenever he could and spent nearly all day there if he could.
Here's a paragraph here now of where my father looks back on his career and how it began and how he was trained, etc.
The first butler I worked for was, I believe, one of the most experienced and had been employed in some of the highest families in England. I learned a lot about silver from him. His successor was of a different calibre altogether, and only worked when his employer's eye was upon him. The door of our pantry looked out into a long passage leading to the kitchen. Every morning he made it a point to cover the pantry table with all the silver available. Thus, the lady of the house, returning from interviewing the cook in the kitchen, would see him with sleeves tucked up, polishing most industriously. When she had passed upstairs, the silver was immediately dumped back into the cupboard. He then disappeared into his bedroom next door to the pantry, where he kept a large album of French postcards and magnifying glass. The fact was, I did all his work, as well as my own. When I left, he lasted exactly 1 week, but at least I did get good experience in silver and butler's work in general there.
So you can see that he was really skiving away from his work as much as possible. And then he was gone off to his bedroom or whatever to look at his French postcards and with a magnifying glass, if you don't mind. I suppose it's something analogous today to people going on the internet to look up risque, questionable sites. So we shall leave it at that, I suppose. People's human nature hasn't really changed. It's just the media that they use has changed, I suppose. The very last little note says, the foregoing, I'm afraid, is of a very small proportion of the knowledge required for a butler's job. Perhaps, though, I'm exaggerating, and you will, I hope, learn as you go along. If you can give Malahide 34 years' service, as I have done, you will not be doing so badly. So here's wishing you good luck and success. And that's the last little bit of a note. And he did say that if you don't get on well with the staff, I'm afraid it will be not their fault, it will be your fault, as I have found them helpful and courteous in every respect. So that was it, and the notes were then typed up by my eldest sister, and a copy was kept. And of course, this is the copy that I'm looking at now. My father died, as I said, in 1972. The Lord died in 1973. He was on a yacht in the Mediterranean in a heart attack. So the new butler, if you like, only lasted less than a year in the job, and after that, that was the end of butlering in Malahide Castle. Well, that's all I have for today, and I hope you enjoyed that little snippet about Butler's life in Malahide Castle. Maybe another topic for another day.